China just posted 5% GDP growth. On paper, that's a number most Western economies would kill for. But underneath that headline sits a set of numbers that tell a completely different story. Numbers the Chinese government itself has quietly acknowledged. Local government debt has now crossed 100 trillion yuan, pushing total debt close to the size of the entire economy. Youth unemployment for workers under 25 sits above 16%. Prices have been falling, not rising, for 10 straight quarters. And in the property sector, the engine that built modern China, investment has collapsed by as much as 80% from its peak. This is what a debt bomb looks like before it goes off. Not a single dramatic crash, but a slow, grinding erosion that the headline numbers are built to hide. Start with the debt itself, because this is the foundation everything else stands on. For decades, Chinese local governments funded roads, bridges, subways, and entire new cities through special financing vehicles, essentially shadow entities that could borrow money off the official books. It worked brilliantly as long as land prices kept rising because governments sold land to developers to pay off the debt. But land prices didn't keep rising. They collapsed alongside the property market. And now, those local governments are sitting on obligations that Chinese state media itself has now admitted exceed 100 trillion yuan, roughly $14 trillion, spread across provinces and cities that have no realistic way to grow their way out of it. That property collapse deserves its own explanation, because for the average Chinese household, real estate wasn't just an investment, it was almost the entire investment. Something like 70% of household wealth in China has historically been tied up in property, far higher than in the United States or Europe. When developers like Evergrande began defaulting years ago, it wasn't just a corporate failure. It was the first crack in the foundation of how ordinary Chinese families store and grow their savings. Home prices have now been falling year over year across 70 major cities, and new construction has fallen so far that entire categories of jobs, construction workers, cement suppliers, furniture makers, moving companies, have simply evaporated along with it. Which brings us to the human cost. And this is where the story stops being abstract. China produced nearly 12 million university graduates in a single recent year, a record number, and also a trap. The economy that was supposed to absorb them, the high-skill, white-collar economy Beijing spent 2 decades promising, isn't creating jobs fast enough to match. Youth unemployment for workers aged 16 to 24, excluding students, has repeatedly climbed above 16%, and unofficial estimates from independent economists suggest the real number, if you count people who've simply given up looking or moved back in with their parents, could be dramatically higher. There's even a term for it now, circulating on Chinese social media: lying flat. A generation choosing to opt out of the ultra-competitive career ladder entirely because the ladder no longer seems to lead anywhere. Then there's deflation, which sounds harmless. Falling prices, who doesn't like that? But is actually one of the most dangerous signals in economics. When prices fall consistently, consumers delay purchases because they expect things to get cheaper tomorrow. Businesses cut prices to compete, which cuts their margins, which means they hire less and invest less. China has now been stuck in this pattern for roughly 10 consecutive quarters, an extraordinarily long stretch that mirrors uncomfortably what Japan went through in the 1990s, a slump that Japan never fully escaped, even 30 years later. And underneath all of this sits a demographic problem that no stimulus package can fix. China's birth rate has fallen to its lowest level ever recorded, even after the government scrapped its one-child policy and started offering financial incentives for families to have more kids. A shrinking, aging population means a shrinking future workforce, a growing burden of elderly care, and less consumer demand for the exact same economy that's already struggling to generate demand today. Debt problems are solvable if an economy grows its way out of them. Demographic decline makes that escape route narrower every single year. Beijing knows all of this. The Politburo has already discussed accelerating bond issuance for new infrastructure stimulus, which sounds proactive until you realize this is the exact same playbook that built the debt bomb in the first place. Build more, borrow more, hope growth eventually outpaces the debt. It's worked before, when China was earlier in its development and had decades of catch-up growth ahead of it. It's a much harder trick to pull off for the world's second largest economy, already saturated with roads, railways, and apartment towers nobody's buying. What makes China's situation genuinely unusual compared to countries like Pakistan or Argentina is that this isn't a country that's run out of money. China has enormous foreign currency reserves and one of the largest manufacturing bases on the planet. This is a country that has run out of the easy version of its own growth model and hasn't yet found a replacement that doesn't require ordinary households to spend money they're increasingly afraid to spend. The next few years will decide whether China manages a slow, controlled deceleration the way policymakers hope, or whether the debt, the demographics, and a generation of unemployed graduates collide into something much harder to control.